Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight, we're drifting off into the history of the Mexican drug cartels, how they were formed and influenced Mexico's government, and the latest, how Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, was killed in Talpalpa in the western Mexico state of Jalisco on Sunday, February 22nd, 2026. Let's dive in. Long before the names Sinaloa, Jalisco, or Los Zetas ever sent a shiver down anyone's spine, there was simply the land, vast, sun-scorched stretches of northwestern Mexico where the soil was too poor for most crops, but just right for one. The Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range, cutting through the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, would become the cradle of everything that followed. The people who lived there were hardy, isolated, and largely forgotten by the government in Mexico City. And in that forgetting, something took root. It began, as so many dark chapters do, with something almost innocent. In the early 20th century, Chinese immigrants who had come to Mexico to work on the railroads brought with them the knowledge of cultivating opium poppies. The plant flourished in the mountain valleys of Sinaloa, and local farmers, campesinos with few other options, quickly learned that a field of poppies was worth more than anything else they could grow. This was the 1910s and 1920s, and the world was a different place. There were no cartels yet, no billion-dollar smuggling networks. There were just farmers, and a crop, and a growing market to the north. That market to the north was the United States, and it would remain the engine driving everything for the next 100 years. During World War II, something unexpected happened that would quietly shape the future of Mexican drug trafficking in ways no one anticipated at the time. The United States government, needing morphine for its wounded soldiers overseas, actually encouraged Mexican farmers to grow more opium poppies to meet the wartime demand. It was a decision made in desperation and pragmatism, and when the war ended, the infrastructure, the knowledge, the fields, the networks of buyers and sellers didn't simply disappear. It remained, humming quietly in those mountain valleys, waiting. Through the 1940s and 1950s, the trade was modest and relatively disorganized. Small family operations moved opium paste and, later, heroin across the border in modest quantities. The Mexican government was aware of it, and here is where one of the most important and least discussed threads of this story begins to weave itself in: corruption. From the very earliest days of drug trafficking in Mexico, local police, military officials, and politicians were not adversaries of the trade. They were participants in it. They took their cuts, they looked away, they provided protection. This wasn't incidental to the story of the cartels. It was foundational to it. Without the complicity of the Mexican state, the cartels as we know them could never have grown to the size they did. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, marijuana had joined heroin as a major export, driven north by enormous demand from American youth culture. The operations grew larger, more profitable, and more organized. And then came the man who, more than perhaps anyone else, can be called the architect of the modern Mexican drug trade. His name was Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, and he would one day be known simply as El Padrino, the Godfather. Félix Gallardo was born in Sinaloa in 1946, and from a young age, he displayed the kind of intelligence and social cunning that, in another life, might have made him a senator or a CEO. He became a judicial police officer. Again, that thread of state complicity winding through the story, and used his position and connections to begin building a smuggling network. He was patient, methodical, and ruthless when he needed to be, but he preferred negotiation to violence. He understood something that the more impulsive traffickers around him did not: that stability was profitable, and chaos was bad for business. Through the 1970s, he steadily consolidated power, bringing together the various independent smuggling operations of Sinaloa under something resembling a unified organization. But the event that truly transformed the scale of Mexican drug trafficking came from an unlikely direction. Not from Mexico, but from the skies above the Caribbean. In the early 1980s, the United States government, under the Reagan administration, dramatically intensified its interdiction efforts against Colombian cocaine traffickers who were at the time moving their product through South Florida and the Caribbean islands. The crackdown worked in the narrow sense that it disrupted those specific routes, but it did not reduce demand, and the Colombian cartels, led by Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel and later the Cali cartel, needed new pathways into the United States. They turned to Mexico. They approached Félix Gallardo and struck a deal. Mexican traffickers would use their existing border-crossing networks to move Colombian cocaine into the U.S., and in exchange they would receive a percentage of each shipment. At first, the Mexicans were paid in cash. Then, as the arrangement deepened and trust grew, they began to be paid partly in product, actual cocaine that they could then sell themselves. This shift was seismic. Almost overnight, the Mexican trafficking organizations transformed from relatively modest smuggling operations into major players in the most lucrative illegal drug market on the planet. The money that began flowing through Sinaloa and across the border was of a scale that made everything that had come before look like pocket change. Félix Gallardo, now at the height of his power, presided over what was known as the Guadalajara Cartel, an organization that, for a brief period in the mid-1980s, functioned almost like a regulated monopoly, with Félix Gallardo as its quiet, controlling chairman. He moved his operations to Guadalajara, Mexico's second city, to be closer to the financial and political power he needed to protect his empire. He threw lavish parties attended by politicians, police commanders, and businessmen. He was, by many accounts, hiding in plain sight, a wealthy, well-connected businessman whom everyone knew and no one officially acknowledged. But it could not hold, and the event that cracked it open was one of the most consequential and brutal moments in the entire history of this story. In February of 1985, a DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena was kidnapped on the streets of Guadalajara. He had been getting close, dangerously close, to the inner workings of the Guadalajara Cartel, and men like Félix Gallardo and his associates Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto, decided to silence him. Camarena was tortured for over 30 hours. His interrogation was recorded on tapes that DEA agents would later describe as among the most disturbing things they had ever heard. He was killed, and his body was dumped in a field in the state of Michoacan. The murder of Kiki Camarena sent shockwaves through the United States government and fundamentally altered the relationship between Washington and Mexico City on the issue of drug trafficking. The Reagan administration applied enormous diplomatic pressure, and the Mexican government, for once, was forced to act. Caro Quintero fled, but was eventually captured in Costa Rica. Don Neto was arrested. Félix Gallardo himself managed to avoid arrest for several more years, but he understood that the walls were closing in, and he began a plan for what would come next. In 1989, he convened a meeting, reportedly held in Acapulco, of the major trafficking figures of Mexico. And at that meeting, he did something no one had done before. He divided the country. He carved Mexico into plazas, territories, and assigned each to a different organization. The Pacific Coast and the state of Sinaloa went to the brothers Arellano Felix, and to a quiet, methodical trafficker named Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Lora. The border crossing of Juarez went to another group, Tijuana went to the Arellano Félix family. It was a rational, almost corporate restructuring, an attempt to prevent the kind of turf wars that he knew would erupt when central authority collapsed. A few weeks after the meeting, Félix Gallardo was arrested. In the age of the independent cartels, the era that would define the next 3 decades of Mexican history, had begun. When Félix Gallardo was arrested in 1989 and the territories were divided, there was a moment, brief, fragile, where the arrangement he had designed might have held. The plazas were clearly defined, the agreements were understood, and the men who inherited them were, for the most part, experienced enough to know that peace was more profitable than war. But human nature, greed, and the almost incomprehensible sums of money now flowing through these organizations made stability an illusion. Within just a few years, the careful architecture Félix Gallardo had constructed would begin to crack, and out of those cracks would emerge the 2 most powerful and violent cartel dynasties of the 1990s. The first was in Tijuana, the Arellano Félix brothers. There were 7 of them, which gave their organization an almost dynastic quality, took control of the Tijuana Plaza, and immediately began running it with a combination of extreme violence and surprising sophistication. The brothers came from a middle-class family in Sinaloa, and several of them had attended university, which set them apart from the more rough-edged traffickers of their generation. They understood public relations in their way. They cultivated an image of untouchability. Benjamin, the eldest, was the strategist, calm, cerebral, the one who managed the money and the politics. His brother Ramon was the opposite, impulsive, fearless, and genuinely terrifying. Ramon Arellano Félix personally participated in acts of violence that most cartel leaders would have delegated a dozen layers down. He seemed to enjoy it. The Tijuana Cartel, as their organization became known, controlled one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the entire drug trade. The border crossing between Tijuana and San Diego, California, through which hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana passed each year. To protect that crossing, they built a security apparatus of remarkable reach, corrupting police, military officers, and customs officials on both sides of the border. At their peak in the mid-1990s, the Arellano Félix brothers were considered by American law enforcement to be among the most dangerous criminals in the Western Hemisphere. But even as the Tijuana Cartel was consolidating power in the Northwest, a far more consequential organization was taking shape in the state of Sinaloa. Among the men who had received a plaza in Félix Gallardo's 1989 division was the trafficker who had quietly been building his reputation throughout the late 1980s, Joaquin Guzman Lara, who by now had acquired a nickname that would one day become perhaps the most famous alias in the history of organized crime. They called him El Chapo, Shorty, a reference to his height of just 5 feet 6 inches. He had grown up in the tiny mountain village of La Tuna in the Sinaloan highlands, the son of a poppy farmer who beat him and left the family destitute. He had begun working in the drug trade as a teenager, running errands and learning the business from the ground up. By the time Félix Gallardo recognized his talents and elevated him, El Chapo had already demonstrated the qualities that would define his career: an almost supernatural ability to avoid capture, a talent for logistics, and a willingness to be more ruthless than whoever stood in his way. In the early 1990s, El Chapo and the organization around him, which included a powerful trafficker named Hector El Güero Palma and, crucially, the Beltran-Leyva brothers, who would later become enemies, began to chafe against the territorial agreements. The Sinaloa organization believed it was more capable, more efficient, and more deserving of a larger share than the arrangement allowed. Tensions with the Arellano Félix brothers in Tijuana escalated from rivalry to open warfare, and in November 1992, that warfare produced an event so brazen it shocked even the hardened observers of Mexican organized crime. At a discotheque in Puerto Vallarta called Christine, gunmen loyal to El Chapo attempted to assassinate the Arellano Félix brothers. The brothers escaped, but 6 people were killed in the attack, including several of the brothers' bodyguards. The response from Tijuana was swift and ultimately far more consequential. On May 24, 1993, at the Guadalajara International Airport, a team of Arellano Félix assassins was waiting for El Chapo. He escaped, again, that almost supernatural quality, but in the ensuing gun battle, a man sitting in a nearby car was shot dead. That man was Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, one of the most senior figures in the Mexican Catholic Church. The killing of a cardinal at a major international airport was a catastrophe for the cartels, and it forced the Mexican government into a response it could not diplomatically avoid. El Chapo was arrested in Guatemala shortly after and extradited to Mexico, where he was imprisoned at a maximum security facility called Puente Grande in the state of Jalisco. His imprisonment would last about 8 years. We will return to what happened at the end of those 8 years, because it is one of the most audacious stories in the entire history of this era. But while El Chapo was behind bars, the landscape of Mexican drug trafficking continued to shift in ways that would ultimately reshape everything. On the other side of the country, in the Gulf of Mexico port city of Matamoros, a different kind of organization had been quietly growing in power. The Gulf Cartel was older than Sinaloa in some ways. Its roots stretched back to a bootlegger and small-time smuggler named Juan Nepomuceno Guerra, who had been moving contraband across the Texas border since the days of Prohibition. By the 1980s, his nephew Juan Garcia Abrego had transformed the family operation into a major cocaine trafficking organization, using the same logic as the Sinaloa traffickers. Partner with the Colombians, take a cut of the product, build your own distribution network. Garcia Abrego was so effective that he became the first Mexican drug trafficker to be placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He was arrested in 1996 and extradited to the United States, becoming the first Mexican national to be extradited to the U.S. on drug charges. His arrest created a vacuum at the top of the Gulf Cartel, and into that vacuum stepped a man named Ojael Cardenas Guillen. And with him came a decision that would have consequences no one could fully anticipate. Cardenas Guillen was cunning and paranoid in equal measure, a man who had clawed his way to the top of the Gulf Cartel through treachery and murder, including the killing of 2 close friends he suspected of disloyalty. Once in control, he understood that his position was precarious. Rivals inside the organization, the Mexican military, and American law enforcement all represented threats. He needed a protection force unlike anything the cartels had previously assembled, and so he turned to the Mexican military. Specifically, he recruited from the GAF, the Grupo Aeromovil de Fuerzas Especiales, an elite special forces unit that had been trained in counterinsurgency tactics, often with assistance from the United States military and the School of the Americas. These are not ordinary soldiers. They were trained in surveillance, weapons handling, tactical combat, and intelligence gathering at a level that put them in an entirely different category from the street-level enforcers the cartels typically employed. A group of these deserters, somewhere between 30 and 100 men, depending on the source, began working as Cardenas Guillen's personal security force and enforcement arm. They called themselves Los Zetas, after the radio code designation used by their original commander, a lieutenant named Arturo Guzman de Quena, whose call sign was Zuan. The arrival of Los Zetas was a rupture in the history of Mexican organized crime. Before them, cartel violence, as terrible as it had been, was largely the violence of gangsters, brutal, often personal, and driven by the immediate logic of profit and revenge. Los Zetas brought something different. They brought military doctrine, military discipline, and military-grade weapons to a criminal enterprise. They conducted operations with a precision and coordination that the Mexican federal police were genuinely unprepared to confront. They established safe houses, trained new recruits, and developed intelligence networks. They were, in the most unsettling sense of a word, professionals. For a time, this arrangement served Cardenas Guillen well. The Gulf Cartel's control over its territory in Tamaulipas and along the Texas border became nearly absolute. Rival organizations kept their distance. But even Cardenas Guillen could not maintain his freedom indefinitely. In 2003, after a gun battle in Matamoros that involved over 200 soldiers and lasted several hours, he was arrested. He would eventually be extradited to the United States in 2007. And Los Zetas, the force he had created, would not simply disband. They had become too powerful, too organized, and too dangerous to be controlled. They had their own ambitions now. All of this, the Tijuana Wars, El Chapo's imprisonment, the rise of the Gulf Cartel, the birth of Los Zetas, was playing out against a backdrop that deserves a moment of attention, because without understanding the political context, the story of the cartels is incomplete. From 1929 until the year 2000, Mexico was governed without interruption by a single political party, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. 71 years of unbroken rule, which is a remarkable thing in any democracy. And one of the mechanisms by which the PRI maintained that rule was a carefully managed relationship with the drug trade. This was not a secret in Mexico, though it was rarely spoken of openly. The cartels paid, the PRI facilitated, and a certain equilibrium was maintained. Drug trafficking existed, but it was controlled, channeled, negotiated. The violence was contained. In the year 2000, that equilibrium ended. The PRI lost the presidency for the first time in 7 decades to the conservative pan-party candidate Vicente Fox. It was, by any measure, a democratic triumph, the kind of peaceful transfer of power that Mexico had never before experienced. But for the cartels, it was destabilizing in ways that Fox and his advisors did not fully anticipate. The old networks of negotiation and corruption that had kept violence manageable were disrupted. The new government had neither the institutional relationships nor, in many cases, the appetite to maintain the informal agreements that had existed under the PRI. And into the uncertainty that followed, the cartels did what organizations under pressure always do. They competed, they expanded, and they fought. The year 2001 began with a piece of news that traveled through every law enforcement agency in the United States and every rival cartel in Mexico, like an electric current. On January 19th, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman walked out of Puente Grande, one of Mexico's most secure federal prisons, and vanished. The official story, the one that prison authorities initially offered with what, in retrospect, seems like remarkable audacity, was that he had hidden inside a laundry cart being pushed out of the facility by a sympathetic guard. The reality, as investigations would later reveal, was considerably more embarrassing for the Mexican government. El Chapo had not escaped so much as he had been released. The corruption at Puente Grande ran from the guards all the way up through the administration. He had been living, by the accounts of fellow inmates and staff, in a condition of extraordinary comfort, with access to alcohol, women, fine food, and a mobile phone. When the moment came, the doors were simply opened for him. 73 prison employees were eventually investigated in connection with his escape. It was less a jailbreak than a politely conducted checkout. He returned to Sinaloa, to the mountains where he had grown up, and immediately set about rebuilding and expanding the organization that would come to bear the name of that state. The Sinaloa Cartel, as it became formally known to law enforcement and journalists, was in many ways El Chapo's creation, though it was never entirely his alone. The organization was more of a federation than a traditional hierarchical cartel, a collection of powerful traffickers who cooperated under a loose common banner, sharing routes and resources while maintaining their own operations. Among the most important of these partners was a man named Ismael Olmedo Zambada, who in some ways was El Chapo's equal in complement. Where El Chapo was bold, visible, and prone to the kind of dramatic gestures that made headlines, Zambada was a ghost. He had never been arrested. He gave almost no interviews. He moved quietly through Sinaloa, protected by a web of loyalty and fear so dense that for decades the Mexican military essentially could not touch him. The two men together, the flamboyant fugitive and the invisible strategist, made the Sinaloa Cartel into something that functioned with a resilience no single leader organization could have matched. Through the early 2000s, the Sinaloa Cartel expanded aggressively, not just in volume, but in geography. El Chapo had an instinct for logistics that bordered on genius. He invested in infrastructure, not just the tunnels under the U.S. border for which he would eventually become famous, but warehouses, fleets of vehicles, legitimate businesses used for money laundering, and a network of informants inside Mexican law enforcement so extensive that, on more than one occasion, he was tipped off about raids minutes before they happened and slipped away. One DEA analyst would later describe trying to catch El Chapo in this period as trying to catch smoke with your hands. But even as El Chapo was rebuilding his empire, the event that would most dramatically reshape the cartel landscape was unfolding not in Sinaloa, but in the mountains of Michoacan, a state on Mexico's Pacific coast that had previously been considered something of a backwater in terms of organized crime. Michoacan had long been a transit state, a place drugs passed through on their way to the border, but it had not been the seat of a major independent trafficking organization. That began to change in the early 2000s, driven in part by the shift in the global drug market away from cocaine and toward methamphetamine. Methamphetamine was different from the other drugs at the center of this story in one crucial respect. It did not need to be grown. Cocaine required Colombian coca fields and a complex extraction process. Heroin required poppy cultivation. Marijuana was agricultural. But methamphetamine could be manufactured, synthesized from chemical precursors in a laboratory. This meant that any organization with access to the right chemicals, a cook with the necessary knowledge, and enough ruthlessness to protect the operation could become a major player in the drug trade almost regardless of where they were located. And the precursor chemicals, primarily pseudoephedrine, could be imported, often legally, from Asia. A group of traffickers in Michoacan, operating initially under the umbrella of the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas, recognized this opportunity and began building a methamphetamine production operation of industrial scale. They called themselves La Familia Michoacana, and they were, from their very beginning, one of the strangest and most unsettling organizations in the history of Mexican organized crime. Their leader, a man named Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, who went by the nickname El Mas Loco, the craziest one, had developed what could only be described as a personal religious ideology. He wrote and distributed a book of spiritual teachings that his followers were required to study. La Familia presented itself, with apparent sincerity, as a defender of Michoacan's communities against the predations of other criminal organizations. It prohibited its members from using the drugs they sold. It handed out food and money to poor families in the communities where it operated. It positioned itself as a kind of armed social movement with a theological dimension. This was, of course, a layer of justification over what was in practice an extraordinarily violent criminal enterprise. La Familia's methods of dealing with enemies and rivals were among the most viscerally shocking of any organization of this era. In September of 2006, gunmen entered the Sol Y Sombra nightclub in the city of Uruapan, cleared the dance floor, and rolled 5 severed human heads across it, leaving a note that read, in effect, that this was divine justice. It was a message designed not just to intimidate rivals, but to announce to the entire country and to the world that something new and different had arrived in Mexican organized crime. That same month, September 2006, was also when a new president took office in Mexico, and his arrival would mark the beginning of what many historians now regard as the most violent and consequential period in the entire history of the cartels. Felipe Calderón won the 2006 presidential election by an extraordinarily narrow margin, less than half a percentage point, and his victory was contested by his opponent and significant portions of the Mexican public. He needed, in the parlance of politics, a way to establish his authority and legitimacy quickly. He found it in the cartels. Within weeks of taking office, Calderón made a decision that his supporters would later call courageous and his critics would call catastrophic. He declared a full-scale war on the drug cartels and deployed the Mexican military, not just the federal police, but the army itself, into the streets of cities and states controlled by the major trafficking organizations. It began in Michoacan, symbolically, with military convoys rolling into cities that had been effectively governed by La Familia. But it rapidly spread. Soldiers set up checkpoints on highways. Military commanders took over law enforcement functions in cartel-controlled regions. Calderón framed it in the starkest terms. The Mexican state would reassert its authority over its own territory, regardless of the cost. The cost turned out to be staggering, not because the strategy failed to kill or capture cartel members. It did both, in substantial numbers, but because it disrupted the existing power structures without replacing them with anything stable. And the cartels responded to military pressure the way organizations under existential threat tend to respond, with escalating violence directed at everyone they perceived as an enemy. That meant rival cartels. It meant law enforcement and soldiers. And increasingly it meant journalists, mayors, judges, and ordinary civilians who happened to be in the wrong place. The homicide rate in Mexico, which had been declining through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, began a climb in 2007. By 2010, it had more than doubled. Entire cities became effectively ungovernable. The epicenter of this violence was a place that had not previously been known as a particular stronghold of any one cartel. The border city of Ciudad Juarez, directly across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas. Juarez had long been an important crossing point, and for years it had been controlled by the Juarez Cartel, one of the organizations established in the aftermath of Felix Gallardo's 1989 division of territories. But El Chapo and the Sinaloa organization wanted Juarez. Its border crossing was simply too valuable to leave in rival hands, and in the years following his escape from prison, he had been systematically moving to take it. The result was a war between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Juarez Cartel, fought in the streets of a city of 1.3 million people, that turned Juarez into what was statistically, for several years running, the most violent city on earth. In 2010 alone, more than 3,000 people were killed there. gum and shot patients in hospital beds. They killed people at birthday parties and quinceañeras. They murdered a group of teenagers at a house party, mistaking them for rival gang members. And the grief and outrage that followed briefly cracked open a national conversation about what the war on drugs was actually doing to Mexican society. And through all of this, the military deployments, the massacres, the decapitations, the cities drowning in blood, the drugs continued to flow north. Not less, not slower. The street price of cocaine in the United States barely moved. The fundamental logic of the trade, the iron law of supply and demand that had been driving this story since those first poppy fields in the Sinaloa Mountains a century earlier, was entirely unaffected by the war being fought in its name. By 2008 and 2009, the map of Mexican organized crime had become something almost impossible to follow, a constantly shifting diagram of alliances, betrayals, splinter groups, and new organizations rising from the wreckage of old ones. To understand how it got that complicated, it helps to go back to the relationship that had defined the eastern half of the country for the better part of a decade, the partnership between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas. That relationship had always contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The Zetas had been created as a tool, an enforcement arm, a private military, but tools with that degree of capability and organization do not remain tools for long. They develop interests of their own. They accumulate resources, relationships, and territorial influence. And by the late 2000s, the question of who was actually in charge along the Gulf Coast, the Gulf Cartel leadership or the Zetas commanders who controlled the ground, had become genuinely difficult to answer. The breaking point came in 2010, and it came in the way so many breaking points in this story do, through personal betrayal and murder. The precise sequence of events is disputed, but what is known is that in early 2010, the alliance between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas collapsed entirely and violently. The two organizations went to war along the length of the Tamaulipas border, fighting over the plazas they had previously shared. It was a war between former brothers, which made it particularly savage. The Zetas, under the leadership of a man named Heriberto Lazcano, known as El Lasca, and his ambitious lieutenant Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, who went by the designation Z40, proved to be ferocious adversaries. Trevino Morales in particular became notorious for a level of cruelty that even by the standards of this era was considered extreme. He was known to favor a method of execution, placing victims inside oil drums and setting them on fire. That became so associated with his organization, it acquired a name. The narcos called the guiso, the stew. The split between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas was not merely a regional conflict. It sent reverberations through the entire cartel ecosystem, because other organizations were forced to choose sides or exploit the chaos. The Sinaloa Cartel, with the strategic instinct that had characterized it since El Chapo's return to power, largely positioned itself to benefit from the disorder in the east while consolidating its grip on the west and center of the country. It was during this period that a phrase began appearing in the analyses of security researchers and journalists that captured something important about how the conflict was evolving. The idea that Mexico was not experiencing a war on the cartels so much as a war between them, with the Mexican state as a third party whose interventions often accelerated the violence without determining its outcome. Into this landscape arrived an organization that represented perhaps the final, most complete evolution of what the cartels have been becoming since Los Zetas first demonstrated what military training could do for a criminal enterprise. They emerged from the ruins of La Familia Michoacana, which by 2010 had begun to fracture under the combined pressure of military operations and internal disputes. A group of La Familia's more capable and more ruthless commanders, led by a man named Servando Gomez Martinez, known as La Tuda, and a former Catholic seminary student named Enrique Plancarte Solis, broke away and formed a new organization. They called themselves the Knights Templar, and they took La Familia's already unusual blend of religiosity and organized crime to a place that seemed, to outside observers, almost surreal. The Knights Templar dressed their organization in the iconography of the medieval crusading order whose name they had borrowed. They had their own code of conduct, their own ceremonial robes for internal gatherings, their own elaborate mythology about their mission to protect the people of Michoacan from corruption and exploitation. Their leader, La Tuda, gave interviews to journalists and posted videos online in which he complained about the government's treatment of his organization with the aggrieved tone of a man who genuinely believed himself to be misunderstood. He was by turns threatening and oddly reasonable sounding, which made him one of the more bizarre public figures in the entire history of this era. But beneath the medieval costuming and the self-serving ideology was a criminal organization engaged in a range of activities that went significantly beyond drug trafficking. The Knights Templar had developed what security analysts described as a parallel state in Michoacan, a system of taxation and control that extended over virtually every economic activity in the regions they dominated. Avocado farmers paid them, lawn growers paid them, iron or miners paid them, businesses paid them, individuals paid them. They controlled which trucks could use which roads. They determined who could open a business and who could not. They kidnapped for ransom. They extorted with a systematic thoroughness that made them, in economic terms, something closer to a feudal authority than a drug trafficking organization. The drugs were still there. The methamphetamine labs still operated, the shipments still moved north, but they had become just one revenue stream among many. This expansion into extortion and what analysts called predatory governance would prove to be enormously consequential, because unlike drug trafficking, which, whatever its moral dimensions, was a transaction between willing buyers and sellers, extortion and taxation imposed on ordinary working people created a different kind of enemy. It created communities that had nothing to gain from the cartel's existence and everything to lose from it. And in Michoacan, those communities eventually fought back in a way that had no real precedent in the history of this conflict. In early 2013, in a small town in the Tierra Caliente region of Michoacan, a group of farmers and townspeople took up arms against the Knights Templar. They called themselves auto defenses, self-defense groups, and they were, at their origin, exactly what the name suggested: ordinary citizens who had decided that neither the cartel nor the government was going to protect them, and that they would therefore protect themselves. They set up roadblocks. They patrolled their towns with hunting rifles and homemade weapons. They began, town by town, to push the Knights Templar out of the communities they had controlled. The auto-defensive movement spread with a speed that suggested how thoroughly the Knights Templar had alienated the population. By mid-2013, self-defense groups had appeared across the Tierra Caliente region, and their leaders, men like Jose Manuel Morelos, a soft-spoken doctor who became the movement's most recognizable face, were giving interviews to national and international media, describing with calm specificity the kidnappings, the extortion, and the murders they had endured. The movement attracted enormous sympathy, and it created a genuine problem for the Calderon government and for the incoming administration of Enrique Peña Nieto, who had taken office in December 2012. The auto defenses were technically illegal. Private citizens were not permitted under Mexican law to form armed groups, but moving against them with force would mean siding, in effect, with the Knights Templar against the people the government had failed to protect. The Peña Nieto administration's response was revealing in ways that, again, spoke to the deeply complicated relationship between the Mexican state and the organizations it was nominally fighting. Rather than dismantling the auto defenses, the government eventually moved to incorporate them, bringing them under a legal framework as officially recognized rural police forces, which was a solution that satisfied almost no one and created new problems of its own. Some of the auto defensa leaders who accepted official status found themselves co-opted or marginalized. Others refused and continued operating outside the law. And in a development that felt, in retrospect, almost inevitable given everything that had come before, it gradually became clear that some of the auto defensa groups had themselves been infiltrated or taken over by cartel elements. In some cases by the very Sinaloa-affiliated organizations that had been quietly supporting them as a proxy force against the Knights Templar. The liberators were, in some corners, becoming indistinguishable from the people they had set out to fight. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, in the western state of Jalisco, something was quietly forming that law enforcement officials would later describe as the most significant development in Mexican organized crime in a generation. A group of traffickers who had previously been aligned with the Sinaloa Federation had broken away and were building an organization of their own, one that would eventually challenge Sinaloa for dominance, take on the Mexican military with a directness that no previous cartel had attempted, and extend its reach into more countries and more markets than any organization that had come before it. They called themselves the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generation, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, and their leader was a man named Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known by a nickname that was both menacing and a little absurd, El Mencho. El Mencho's background was, in its outlines, familiar: a childhood in rural poverty in Michoacan, early involvement in drug trafficking, time spent in a U.S. prison on drug charges before being deported to Mexico, followed by a steady rise through the cartel hierarchy. What distinguished him was a combination of organizational talent and a willingness to escalate confrontations with the state to a degree that previous leaders had generally avoided. In April 2015, the CJNG demonstrated exactly what that willingness looked like in practice. A convoy of Mexican federal police officers was ambushed in the state of Jalisco. 15 officers were killed. It was the deadliest single attack on Mexican law enforcement in years, and it announced to the government, to rival cartels, and to the world that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel intended to be taken seriously. The response from the Mexican military was substantial: airstrikes, ground operations, a significant deployment of federal forces into Jalisco. In what seemed at the time almost unbelievable, the CJNG shot down a military helicopter with a rocket launcher during one of these operations, killing all 8 soldiers aboard. It was the kind of act that, in any previous chapter of this story, would have brought the full weight of the state down on an organization quickly enough to cripple it. Instead, the CJNG survived, adapted, and continued to grow. It was a signal of something important: that the Mexican government's capacity to project force against the cartels had real limits, and that an organization willing to test those limits ruthlessly enough might find that those limits were closer than anyone had wanted to admit. To understand the world the cartels were operating in by the mid-2010s, it helps to step back for a moment from the violence and the politics and look at the drugs themselves, because the product at the center of this story had been changing, and that change was about to produce consequences that would dwarf everything that had come before it. Cocaine had driven the transformation of the Mexican cartels in the 1980s. Methamphetamine had fueled the rise of La Familia and the Knights Templar in Michoacan and given the cartels a manufactured product they could produce domestically. But a third drug was now moving to the center of the story, and it was unlike anything the trafficking organizations had previously handled. Its name was fentanyl, and it would eventually kill more Americans than any drug in history. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, first developed by a Belgian pharmacist in 1960 for use as a surgical anesthetic. It is, by pharmaceutical measure, approximately 100 times more potent than morphine. A quantity the size of a few grains of salt can be lethal. It had existed in medical settings for decades, but what brought it into the illegal drug supply was a combination of factors that converged in the early 2010s in ways that nobody fully anticipated. The United States had been in the grip of an opioid crisis for years, a crisis seeded, with bitter irony, not by the cartels, but by American pharmaceutical companies that had aggressively marketed prescription painkillers like OxyContin in the late 1990s and early 2000s, creating millions of people with opioid dependencies. When those prescriptions became harder to obtain, many of those people turned to heroin. And when the cartels recognized that they could manufacture something far more potent than heroin, something that required no agricultural supply chain, that could be synthesized from precursor chemicals imported from China, and that could be pressed into counterfeit pills indistinguishable from legitimate pharmaceuticals, the economics were irresistible. The Sinaloa Cartel was an early and major mover into fentanyl production, but the CJNG recognized the opportunity just as clearly and pursued it with equal aggression. The cartels did not need to manufacture fentanyl entirely from scratch. They purchased the precursor chemicals, primarily from Chinese suppliers, and processed them in Mexican labs into finished product. The finished product was then pressed into pills, mixed with heroin to increase its potency, or moved across the border in quantities so small that detection was extraordinarily difficult. A single kilogram of fentanyl, purchased for a few $1,000s in precursor chemicals, could be cut and pressed into tens of thousands of pills worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the American street. The profit margins made cocaine look modest by comparison. The human cost of this shift in the drug supply was catastrophic and continues to be. Overdose deaths in the United States, which have been climbing steadily through the prescription opioid years and the heroin years, accelerated sharply once fentanyl entered the supply and volume. By the early 2020s, more than 70,000 Americans were dying of drug overdoses annually, the majority involving synthetic opioids. It was a death toll that exceeded American combat casualties in the Vietnam War, repeated every single year. And because fentanyl was now being pressed into counterfeit pills designed to look like prescription medications, fake Xanax, fake Adderall, fake Percocet, people were dying who had never considered themselves drug users in any traditional sense. Teenagers were dying after taking what they thought was a single pill. The cartels had, essentially without planning it that way, achieved a level of penetration into American society that no previous drug had managed. Back in Mexico, the mid-2010s were a period of almost dizzying complexity in the cartel landscape, and two developments in particular deserve close attention because of the long shadows they cast. The first was the final, spectacular chapter of El Chapo's story. After his 2001 escape from Puente Grande, he had spent over a decade as the world's most famous fugitive, appearing on Forbes magazine's list of the world's wealthiest people, running a global trafficking empire from a series of mountain hideouts and safe houses in Sinaloa, evading capture so repeatedly and so completely that his freedom had begun to seem almost mythological. The Mexican government came close several times. In 2012, under newly elected President Enrique Peña Nieto, the Marines nearly caught him in a resort condo in Cabo San Lucas. He escaped through a tunnel he had reportedly had built into the building for exactly that contingency. In February 2014, they finally caught him in a hotel in Mazatlan, taken in his pajamas and what the Peña Nieto government presented as a crowning achievement. He was returned to a maximum security prison, a different one this time, Altiplano, and the world exhaled. 14 months later, on July 11th, 2015, he was gone again. This escape was even more audacious than the first. A tunnel had been dug from a construction site located nearly a mile from the prison, running underground directly beneath the shower in his cell. The tunnel was ventilated, lit with electric lighting, and equipped with a modified motorcycle on rails to carry workers and materials. The engineering involved was extraordinary. The tunnel dropped sharply to avoid the prison's foundations, and then rose again to connect with the shower drain. When guards checked El Chapo's cell that evening, they found the shower grate removed, and their prisoner vanished. The tunnel had taken months to build. Multiple people inside and outside the prison had to have been complicit. It was, even by the standards of everything this story had produced, breathtaking. His second period of freedom lasted only 6 months. In January 2016, Mexican Marines tracked him to a house in the city of Los Zetas in Sinaloa, after following a trail of communications connected to a production team El Chapo had been working with. He had, in an almost incomprehensible lapse of operational security, been cooperating with the Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo and American actor Sean Penn on a proposed film about his life. The meeting with Penn had been arranged through channels that the intelligence services were monitoring. El Chapo was captured after a gun battle in which 5 of his guards were killed, and he and a companion escaped through the city's storm drains before being caught on a highway. He was extradited to the United States in January 2017, tried in a federal court in Brooklyn, New York, and convicted in February 2019 on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years and transferred to the ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, from which no one has ever escaped. The extradition of El Chapo was a moment that generated enormous headlines on both sides of the border, and for many observers it felt like a kind of closure. The end of a chapter, the capture of the most famous criminal of his generation. But the Sinaloa Cartel barely missed a beat. This was the key lesson that Mexican and American law enforcement had been learning and relearning throughout this entire era, that the cartels had evolved far beyond their dependence on any single leader. El Chapo's longtime partner, the invisible Ismael El Mayo Zambada, continued to run the Sinaloa operation with his customary quiet efficiency. The routes were intact. The networks were intact. The product continued to flow. The kingpin strategy, the idea that capturing or killing the top leader of an organization would cause it to collapse, had been tested repeatedly throughout these decades, and it had repeatedly failed to produce the outcome its proponents predicted. The Sinaloa Cartel did, however, eventually experience the internal fracture that most large criminal organizations suffer sooner or later, and when it came from within the family, quite literally. El Chapo had several sons, and the most prominent of them, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, known as El Güero, and his brothers collectively referred to as Los Chapitos, had been taking on increasing operational roles within the cartel during their father's imprisonment. After El Chapo's extradition, the sons moved aggressively to consolidate their position, and their approach to the business differed from their father's and from Zambada's in ways that generated tension. The Chapitos were more willing to use extreme public violence. They were more deeply invested in the fentanyl trade. Indeed, they were believed by American investigators to be the primary drivers of the cartel's expansion into synthetic opioid production. And they were, by multiple accounts, more difficult to deal with than the old generation of Sinaloa leadership. By the early 2020s, the Sinaloa Cartel was effectively operating as two parallel factions, the Zambada faction and the Chapo faction, that cooperated on some matters and competed on others. Attention held in uneasy suspension by the enormous profits both sides were generating. How long that suspension could hold was a question that hung over the organization. As would become shockingly clear in the years that followed, the answer was not as long as anyone expected. By the early 2020s, the geography of power in Mexican organized crime had simplified in a brutal and clarifying way into something approaching a two-cartel system. On one side was the Sinaloa Cartel, older, more established, its roots running deep into the soil of northwestern Mexico, its networks extending across continents, its leadership fractured, but its operational capacity undiminished. On the other was the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, younger and hungrier, expanding with a speed and aggression that alarmed law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. Between them, they controlled the majority of drug trafficking routes into the United States, and the competition between them was reshaping the violence map of Mexico in real time, pulling smaller regional organizations into their orbits as allies or subordinates, or crushing them outright when they refused to cooperate. The smaller cartels that had defined earlier chapters of this story were, by this point, in various stages of decline or transformation. The Tijuana Cartel, once among the most feared organizations in the country, had been shattered by a combination of internal betrayals, military pressure, and the relentless expansion of the Sinaloa Federation into its territory. The Arellano Felix brothers had died or been captured one by one over the years. Ramon, the violent one, killed in a shootout in 2002. Benjamin, the strategist, arrested. Others imprisoned or dead. What remained of the Tijuana organization by the 2020s was a diminished, largely subordinate entity that survived by accommodating the larger players rather than challenging them. The Juarez Cartel, which had fought so destructively with Sinaloa over the border crossing at Ciudad Juarez, had similarly been reduced. The city's catastrophic violence had eventually subsided, not because the conflict was resolved so much as because Sinaloa had largely won it, and a victor's peace of sorts had settled over a city that had lost thousands of its residents to the war. Los Zetas, the organization that had represented such a rupture in the history of cartel violence, had fragmented after the death of its founder Heriberto Lazcano, killed by Mexican Marines in 2012 in a confrontation that ended with soldiers discovering his body and briefly losing it, as his followers recovered it from the morgue, and subsequent infighting had split the organization into regional factions, the most significant of which, operating in the northeastern states of Tamaulipas and Coahuila, called itself the Cartel del Nordeste. The Knights Templar in Michoacan had collapsed under the combined weight of military operations, the Autodefensa uprising, and the inevitable internal decay that seemed to afflict every organization that tried to mix genuine criminal enterprise with ideological pretension. Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, El Mas Loco, had been reported dead once before. The government announced his killing in 2010, only for him to reappear very much alive 3 years later, which in Mexico prompted more dark humor than surprise. He was finally, verifiably killed by federal forces in 2014. La Tuda, the seminary student turned cartel boss who had given such peculiar media interviews, was captured in 2015. From the ruins of the Knights Templar, new smaller organizations had sprouted, the most significant being a group called Los Viagras, whose name was as absurd as everything else about Michoacan's cartel history, and various other local factions that controlled individual municipalities or economic sectors without achieving anything approaching regional dominance. What had replaced this fragmented middle tier in many parts of the country was something that security researchers increasingly described not as cartels in the traditional sense, but as criminal governance structures. Organizations whose relationship to the territories they controlled had moved so far beyond drug trafficking that the drug trafficking had become almost incidental to their broader economic and political function. In states like Guerrero, Veracruz, and Tamaulipas, cartel-affiliated organizations were collecting taxes, adjudicating disputes, providing security services, regulating local economies, and in some cases delivering social services that the state had abandoned. They were, in the most functional sense of the word, governing, and the population under their control had in many cases developed a relationship with them that was not simply one of terror, but something more complicated, mixing fear with economic dependence, and occasionally with genuine loyalty. This reality posed a challenge that was not merely tactical, but philosophical for the Mexican government and for the United States, which remained deeply invested in Mexican drug policy through a bilateral security framework called the Merida Initiative, launched in 2008, through which Washington had provided billions of dollars in equipment, training, and intelligence assistance to Mexican security forces. The Merida Initiative had been premised, like most American anti-drug policy before it, on the assumption that the problem was essentially one of supply, that if you disrupted the organizations producing and moving drugs, you would reduce the harm on the American side of the border. What the accumulating evidence of 2 decades increasingly suggested was that this model was wrong, or at least incomplete, in ways that neither government found comfortable to acknowledge publicly. The drug supply, despite everything, despite the military deployments, despite the extraditions, despite the billions spent on interdiction, had not been meaningfully reduced. Drugs were cheaper and more potent and more available in the United States in 2020 than they had been in 2000. The violence in Mexico, which the war on cartels was supposed to reduce, had instead been, at minimum, dramatically worsened by the strategy chosen to fight it. And the cartels themselves had evolved, with each disruption, into something more resilient and more diversified than what had existed before. It was as if every attempt to prune the organism had caused it to grow back denser and more deeply rooted. The administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known universally as AMLO, who took office in December 2018, arrived with a philosophy toward the cartels that was an explicit and sometimes dramatic contrast with everything that had come before. AMLO rejected the militarized approach of Calderón and the continuation of that approach under Peña Nieto. His framework, which he summarized in a phrase that became both a slogan and a target for criticism, was abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets. The theory was that the cartels were ultimately a symptom of poverty, inequality, and state abandonment, and that addressing those root causes through social programs and economic investment would, over time, reduce the conditions that made cartel recruitment possible. Violence should be de-escalated rather than met with force. Confrontations that risked civilian casualties should be avoided. The practical expression of this philosophy produced some of the most remarkable and most debated moments of recent Mexican political history. In October 2019, the Mexican government had El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzmán López, briefly in custody in Culiacán, the capital of Sinaloa. The Sinaloa Cartel's response was immediate and overwhelming. Armed convoys of cartel gunmen blocked roads across the city, engaged in firefights with security forces, and took soldiers hostage. The government, faced with the prospect of sustained urban combat that would certainly kill civilians, made the decision to release Ovidio Guzmán. He walked free, and the Sinaloa gunman stood down. The episode became known simply as El Culiacanazo, and the images of military vehicles abandoned under fire in a cartel, essentially dictating terms to the Mexican state, traveled around the world. The government defended the decision as pragmatic, preventing greater loss of life. Its critics described it as a capitulation that demonstrated, more vividly than any policy paper or security analysis could, the actual balance of power between the Mexican state and its most powerful criminal organizations. Ovidio Guzman was arrested again in January 2023 under the administration that succeeded AMLO's, and his capture provoked another round of Sinaloa Cartel violence across multiple cities. Roadblocks, burning vehicles, attacks on airports and military installations, before eventually subsiding. He was extradited to the United States in 2023, joining his father in the American federal justice system. The pattern was by now achingly familiar. The dramatic capture, the violent response, the extradition, and the cartel continuing to function. It was against this backdrop, the two-cartel system, the fentanyl crisis, the philosophical debate about whether the war on drugs could ever be won, the Mexican state's fluctuating and often compromised capacity to confront organizations that had become embedded in the economic and social fabric of entire regions, that the final and most unexpected rupture in the Sinaloa Cartel's history played out. In July 2024, something happened that no one in the cartel world or the law enforcement world had anticipated, and it shook the foundations of the oldest and largest trafficking organization in Mexican history. Ismael Olmedo Zambada, the ghost, the man who had never been arrested in 6 decades of criminal activity, the invisible strategist who had outlasted every partner and every rival, was arrested in El Paso, Texas. He had not been caught through surveillance or military operation. He had been lured, and the man who lured him was one of El Chapo's own sons, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the same El Güero who had been operating as one of the Chapitos faction leaders. Zambada claimed he had been kidnapped and transported to the United States against his will, taken to a ranch in Sinaloa, bundled onto a private plane, and delivered to American authorities by Guzman Lopez, who himself surrendered to the DEA as part of what appeared to be a negotiated arrangement. The betrayal was of a magnitude that had no precedent in the history of the Sinaloa Cartel. Zambada, now in his mid-70s, was in American custody facing charges he would not live to complete serving if convicted. And the faction war within Sinaloa that had been simmering for years ignited into open conflict almost immediately as Zambada loyalists and Chapitos loyalists began killing each other in the streets of Culiacan and the surrounding Sinaloan countryside with a ferocity that turned the cartel's own heartland into a war zone. It was, in many ways, the most dramatic proof yet of a truth this entire story had been demonstrating for decades, that the cartels, for all their power and resilience, carried within themselves the same human vulnerabilities that had undone criminal organizations throughout history. Greed, ambition, betrayal, and the fundamental impossibility of trust among people whose entire world was built on violence and deception. The monster, when it could not find enemies outside, turned and began to devour itself. To arrive at the present moment, at a small mountain town in Jalisco on a February morning in 2026, we need to understand what the cartel landscape looked like in the final years leading up to it. Because the ending of this story, like every other chapter, did not come from nowhere. It came from a long chain of cause and effect, of pressure and counter-pressure, of decisions made in Washington and Mexico City and in the mountain hideouts of men who had spent their lives avoiding exactly the fate that eventually found them. The Sinaloa Cartel's internal war, ignited by the betrayal of El Mayo Zambada in the summer of 2024, continued to burn through the latter half of that year into 2025. Culiacan, the city that had for decades been something of a cartel capital, a place where the narco economy was so deeply woven into daily life that it had developed its own aesthetic, its own architecture, its own music, became a city under siege from within. The Chapitos faction and the Zambada loyalists, sometimes called the Mayo faction or the Mayos, fought block by block for control of the plazas, the routes, and the organizational infrastructure that both sides had inherited. Hundreds were killed. Families fled. The violence was of the kind that Mexico had seen before in places like Juarez a decade and a half earlier. Indiscriminate, ferocious, and almost entirely beyond the capacity of local authorities to contain or influence. The Mexican government, now under President Claudia Sheinbaum, who had taken office in October 2024 as Mexico's first female president, inherited this crisis along with everything else. Sheinbaum, a scientist by training and a protege of AMLO, faced the same impossible arithmetic that had defeated every one of her predecessors. A security crisis of enormous complexity, institutions corroded by decades of corruption, a population exhausted by violence, and a relationship with the United States that had become, by 2025, significantly more fraught than at any point in recent memory. That friction with Washington had a specific and dramatic cause. In early 2025, the administration of President Donald Trump, who had returned to the White House in January of that year, designated several Mexican cartels, including the Sinaloa Cartel, the CJNG, and several smaller organizations, as foreign terrorist organizations. It was a designation with profound legal and diplomatic implications, one that the Mexican government resisted strongly, arguing that it represented an infringement on Mexican sovereignty and could open the door to unilateral American military action on Mexican soil. Trump administration officials made statements that were, at minimum, suggestive of exactly that possibility. References to sending American forces into Mexico to deal with the cartels directly, to using the Alien Enemies Act against cartel members, to taking measures that no previous American administration had been willing to contemplate publicly. The diplomatic tension between the two countries reached levels not seen in generations. Mexico recalled ambassadors. American officials made threats. The fentanyl crisis, which had by this point killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and was a source of genuine and legitimate rage on the American side of the border, provided the emotional and political fuel for an escalation in rhetoric that alarmed security experts on both sides. Whether that rhetoric would translate into actual military action remained, through 2025, an open and deeply unsettling question. It was into this atmosphere, the Sinaloa Civil War, the escalating American pressure, the Sheinbaum government trying to navigate between the demands of Washington and the realities of Mexican sovereignty, that the story of El Mencho reached its final chapter. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes had spent the better part of a decade as the most wanted man in Mexico and one of the most wanted in the United States. The DEA had placed a $10 million bounty on his head. He had been the subject of countless military operations, intelligence efforts, and interagency task forces. He had survived all of them, moving constantly through the territories his organization controlled, protected by a security apparatus that was, by all accounts, extraordinarily elaborate and disciplined. Unlike El Chapo, who had in his later years developed a weakness for visibility, the meetings with actors and journalists, the interviews, the social media presence of his family that provided intelligence threads for investigators to pull, El Mencho had remained genuinely, stubbornly invisible. There were almost no confirmed photographs of him taken, after his rise to cartel leadership. His movements were known to only the innermost circle of his organization. He was, in that sense, closer to the model of El Mayo Zambada than to El Chapo, a man who understood that survival required the complete subordination of ego to operational security. And yet, on Sunday, February 22nd, 2026, Mexican security forces located Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes in Tapalpa, a small, picturesque town in the highlands of Jalisco, known for its cobblestone streets and its cool mountain climate, the kind of place that attracts Mexican tourists seeking a quiet weekend away from the cities. It is, in almost every superficial respect, an unlikely setting for the end of one of the most consequential criminal careers in the history of organized crime. He was killed there in an operation that represented the culmination of years of intelligence gathering and the kind of painstaking, methodical surveillance work that rarely makes headlines, but underlies almost every successful operation of this kind. The killing of El Mencho sent the same electric current through law enforcement agencies and cartel organizations that every major leadership death or capture in this story has sent. A moment of genuine shock followed almost immediately by the practical question that this story has asked and answered in the same way, over and over again for 4 decades. What happens to the organization now? The CJNG had, under El Mencho's leadership, built itself into something that in important respects resembled the Sinaloa Cartel of the early 2000s. A diversified, resilient, multi-layered organization with operations in dozens of Mexican states and a presence in drug markets across the United States, Europe, Asia, and Australia. It had subordinate organizations, regional commanders, established routes, and financial infrastructure that did not depend on any single individual to function. El Mencho's wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, had for years been considered a significant operational figure in the organization in her own right. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, had been arrested and extradited to the United States years earlier, removing him from the succession. But the organization had depth in a way that the Sinaloa Cartel had depth, and the history of this entire era strongly suggests that depth is what matters most when a leader falls. We have seen this pattern so many times now that it has acquired the quality of a law. Not a law of justice, but a law of organizational physics. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo falls, and the cartels he created multiply. The Arellano Felix brothers are killed or captured one by one, and the Tijuana Plaza is absorbed rather than eliminated. Ojel Cardenas Guillen is arrested, and Los Zetas, the force he created, grows beyond anything he could control. El Chapo is captured twice and extradited, and the Sinaloa Cartel continues as though he were merely a figurehead who had outlived his operational usefulness. El Mayo Zambada is betrayed and taken, and the organization he built begins a civil war that, in its violence and its economic disruption of the drug supply, may ultimately produce successor organizations more dangerous than the one that preceded them. And now El Mencho is dead, in a mountain town in Jalisco on a winter Sunday, and the CJNG, the organization he built from nothing into a global trafficking enterprise, will face the same test every cartel in this story has faced when its founder is removed. The question of what comes next is not merely an organizational one. It is a human one, and a political one, and ultimately a question about whether the framework within which this entire story has unfolded, the framework of prohibition, interdiction, militarized enforcement, and the treatment of addiction as a criminal matter rather than a public health one, is capable of producing a different outcome than it has produced for the past 50 years. The evidence accumulated across all of those years is not encouraging on that front. Every metric that the war on drugs was designed to improve, availability, price, purity, overdose deaths, violence in producing countries, has moved in the wrong direction over the course of the conflict. The drugs are cheaper, more potent, and more available than they have ever been. The death toll, both in Mexico from the violence and in the United States from overdoses, has climbed to levels that would have seemed unimaginable to the people who first declared that war. None of this is to diminish the genuine evil that this story contains. The cartels have committed atrocities, massacres, forced disappearances, the corruption of institutions that ordinary people depended on for justice and safety, the recruitment of children, the destruction of communities. The men at the center of this story were not romantic outlaws or misunderstood entrepreneurs. They were responsible for suffering on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. El Mencho's CJNG hung bodies from bridges, dissolved enemies in acid, and flooded American communities with a poison that has left scarcely a family in the country untouched. The accounting of what these organizations have cost, in lives, in corrupted institutions, in the compounded trauma of generations of Mexicans living under their shadow, is a debt that cannot be easily calculated and will not be easily repaid. But the story of the Mexican drug cartels is not, finally, a story about bad men doing bad things. It is a story about systems, economic systems, political systems, legal systems, that created the conditions in which those men could rise to the power they achieved. It is a story about poverty in the Sierra Madre and demand in the suburbs of American cities. It is a story about corruption that was not incidental to the Mexican state, but woven into it. It is a story about a policy pursued with remarkable consistency across decades and administrations and billions of dollars that has never achieved its stated goals and has produced consequences far worse than the problem it was designed to solve. The poppy fields are still there, in the mountain valleys of Sinaloa, where this story began. The campesinos who tend them are among the poorest people in Mexico. The drugs they help produce still move north across a border that no wall and no military deployment has ever made meaningfully less permeable. And somewhere in the highlands of Jalisco, in a small town with cobblestone streets, the body of a man who built one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history has just gone cold, and his lieutenants are already doing the arithmetic, already calculating the routes and the alliances and the power vacuums, already writing the next chapter of a story that shows, as yet, no signs of reaching its end. This concludes our journey through the history of the Mexican drug cartels. Thank you for listening, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again and have a good night.